People rarely admit when they're intimidated, but their behavior exposes them long before their words do. Around a Sigma male, those behaviors become even sharper because he carries a presence that doesn't need volume, validation, or performance to dominate a room. His silence forces people to confront themselves, and not everyone can handle what they see. Some get nervous. Some get competitive. Some fall apart without understanding why. But every reaction he triggers reveals a deeper truth about human psychology and about the power of a man who doesn't try to impress anyone. If you've ever felt the shift in the air when a Sigma walks into the room, or noticed how people act differently around someone who's quietly confident, this video will decode that hidden dynamic. These 6 behaviors will show you exactly what intimidation looks like when people can't explain it, only feel it. Before we begin, subscribe to Silent Wise, where we break down the mindsets, tactics, and quiet psychological power that shape the Sigma male. Now let's get into it. They become overly self-conscious, adjusting their behavior the moment he enters the room. His presence shifts the equilibrium instantly, creating a subtle psychological gravity that pulls every hidden insecurity to the surface. People who normally move with confidence suddenly second-guess their gestures, posture, and tone, as if his silence exposes flaws they didn't know they were broadcasting. It isn't intimidation through force. It's the quiet awareness he carries, the way his eyes take in a room without trying to dominate it. That calm makes others feel like they're being measured against a standard they can't quite define. Without speaking a word, he changes how people breathe, how they stand, how they choose their next sentence. He doesn't demand attention. The environment recalibrates around him automatically. As he walks through a space, conversations shift in pitch, people straighten up, laughter becomes tighter, and every action feels strangely rehearsed. They mirror his movements without realizing it, adjusting their rhythm to match the controlled cadence he naturally emits. Some try to impress him through subtle displays, a louder opinion, a forced confidence, a sharper comment, but those efforts collapse under the weight of his unimpressed neutrality. His silence becomes a psychological mirror, reflecting not who he is, but who they fear they are beneath their performed identities. It's not dominance. It's an involuntary reveal triggered simply by his calm, self-contained presence. The room learns quickly that he cannot be manipulated by noise or performance, and that realization forces people inward. They become hyper-aware of every flaw they've hidden behind charm or bravado. They adjust their behavior because he doesn't play the usual social games, and without those games, they have nothing familiar to anchor themselves to. His presence becomes an unspoken test, one they didn't prepare for, and the more they try to regain control of their image, the more exposed they feel. By doing absolutely nothing, he makes others reveal everything. They start over-talking or over-explaining to prove their value. When a Sigma male enters the space with his steady silence and unshakable composure, something shifts inside people who feel insecure around him. Suddenly, their natural rhythm disappears, replaced by a frantic need to fill the quiet he effortlessly maintains. They begin talking too much, adding unnecessary details, stretching simple stories into long monologues, not because they have more to say, but because they're trying to convince him and themselves that they matter. His calm presence becomes a psychological spotlight, illuminating their fear of being overlooked, so they compensate with noise, explanations, and endless justifications. They sense that he isn't easily impressed, and that realization pushes them into a cycle of verbal overcompensation, hoping he'll acknowledge their intelligence or importance. As they talk, their words become tangled with their insecurities. Every slight pause feels threatening, every silence feels like a judgment, and every quiet look from him feels like a request for clarification they don't actually owe. In their attempt to prove their worth, they reveal more about their fears than their strengths. They over-explain obvious points, justify harmless actions, and repeat themselves, as if clarity could compensate for the internal discomfort he unknowingly creates.
They're not speaking to communicate. They're speaking to prevent the discomfort of being silently evaluated by someone whose attention cannot be bought with performance.
His neutrality becomes the canvas where they project their doubts.
What they don't realize is that their overtalking only deepens the power imbalance. The Sigma male listens without reacting, without offering validation, without feeding their need for reassurance. His silence becomes the dominant presence in the exchange, while their words dissolve into noise. Every sentence they add becomes proof of how much they're trying to be seen and how little effort he needs to maintain control of the moment. In their rush to sound valuable, they expose how deeply they fear the possibility that they aren't. They avoid eye contact because his calm gaze feels too revealing. The moment a Sigma male looks at someone, really looks, something inside them tightens. His gaze isn't loud or aggressive, it's steady, quiet, and unsettlingly perceptive. People who feel intimidated sense immediately that he's not just looking at them, he's looking into them. And that calm, unbroken eye contact becomes a mirror they aren't prepared to face. Instead of meeting his eyes, they glance away, fidget, focus on anything else in the room. His silence already carries weight, but his gaze carries truth, and for many, truth is far more difficult to handle. They fear what he might see: insecurity, doubt, hidden motives, emotional instability. His presence demands nothing, yet exposes everything. As the conversation continues, their discomfort grows. Every time his eyes drift back to theirs, they feel a jolt, as if he's peeling back the layers they work hard to hide from the world. They break eye contact quickly, pretending to be distracted or suddenly thoughtful, but the real reason is simpler. They feel naked under his calm scrutiny. The Sigma male doesn't stare to dominate or intimidate. He simply observes the world with clarity that others rarely possess. But that clarity becomes a psychological pressure for those who rely on masks or manipulation. His eyes don't play games, and that's exactly what makes them dangerous to people who do. Eventually, avoiding his gaze becomes a survival instinct. They keep their eyes down, their expressions busy, their attention scattered. Anything to avoid the feeling of being read so effortlessly. What they don't realize is that the avoidance itself reveals more than any eye contact ever could. Their discomfort shows him who is insecure, who is hiding something, who fears being seen, and who lacks the emotional stability to stand in the presence of someone unshaken. His gaze doesn't intimidate because it is harsh. It intimidates because it is honest. And honesty is the one thing many people instinctively run from. They mimic his behavior to feel more in control. When people feel intimidated by a Sigma male, one of the strangest and most revealing behaviors emerges. They begin to mimic him. It's rarely intentional. It's an instinctive attempt to regain balance in a dynamic where they feel outmatched. His calm voice, his slow movements, his measured responses, even his pauses, they start copying these patterns, as if mirroring him will somehow neutralize the effect he has on them. Deep down, they believe that if they act like him, they can reclaim a sense of control, but all it really does is expose how ungrounded they are. The Sigma male doesn't perform his behavior, it's who he is. Their imitation becomes a performance built on insecurity, and he can see it immediately. As they watch him, they adopt his silence, hoping it will make them appear mysterious instead of unsure. They fold their arms the way he does, lower their tone to match his, or start speaking less, thinking this will give them the same psychological presence he naturally carries. But imitation without authenticity collapses quickly. Silence becomes awkward instead of powerful. Calmness feels forced instead of genuine. Stillness turns into stiffness. They don't realize that the Sigma's aura comes from internal stability, introspection, and self-command, traits that cannot be copied like gestures. So while they mimic the surface, the depth is missing, and the contrast becomes even more obvious. Eventually, their imitation becomes a confession without words. It reveals how much his presence disrupts their inner equilibrium. Trying to replicate him only highlights the difference between grounded confidence and reactive insecurity. The Sigma male never asks anyone to match him. He simply exists in his natural rhythm. But when others mimic him, it shows who feels threatened, who feels inferior, and who is trying desperately to regain psychological footing. Their attempt to mirror him is not a sign of admiration, it's a sign of intimidation disguised as adaptation. They become defensive or irritated without logical reason. Defensiveness is one of the clearest signs that someone feels threatened by a Sigma male, even if they don't consciously realize it. The irritation rises not because of anything he does, but because of what he reveals merely by existing in his natural state. His calmness feels like judgment, even when he isn't judging. His silence feels like disapproval, even when he isn't thinking about them. His lack of reaction feels like superiority, even though he isn't trying to compete. People start snapping at small things, making passive-aggressive remarks, or shifting their tone as if they're preparing for a conflict he never intended to start. Their defensiveness doesn't come from logic, it comes from an internal discomfort they don't want to admit he triggers. As the Sigma watches quietly, their irritation grows because they cannot read him, cannot predict him, and cannot influence his emotional state. That unpredictability becomes a psychological mirror, reflecting back their insecurities with painful clarity. They start explaining themselves more than necessary, over-justifying their decisions, or nitpicking his behavior to create a sense of control. But the Sigma's calm presence exposes how fragile their emotional stability is. They become irritated because he doesn't play into their usual social cues. He doesn't argue back, doesn't rise to provocation, and doesn't validate their emotional outbursts. His stillness makes their reactions look exaggerated, almost childish, and they feel it deeply. Soon, their defensiveness becomes a mask that fails to hide what's happening inside them. It reveals insecurity, fear of being seen, and frustration at their inability to affect him. The Sigma male doesn't push them, but his presence pushes something inside them, the part they try to keep hidden. And because they cannot confront that discomfort, they turn it outward in irritation, hoping he'll give them a reason to blame their feelings on anything other than themselves. But he never does. His silence holds up a mirror they'd rather look away from, and their defensive reactions become the confession they never intended to make. They monitor his reactions closely, needing validation he never gives. People who feel intimidated by a Sigma male start watching him the way someone watches a silent storm, cautiously, constantly, and without realizing how obvious it looks. His minimal reactions create a void they desperately try to fill with interpretation. Every eyebrow shift, every pause, every detached glance becomes something they analyze as if it reveals a hidden verdict about them. They need reassurance he never provides, approval he never distributes, and emotional confirmation he never thinks to offer. The Sigma isn't withholding validation to be cold. He simply doesn't operate in that economy. But to those who depend on external feedback for their sense of worth, his neutrality becomes unbearable. They lean in, watch too closely, and project meanings onto silence that was never meant to mean anything. Their internal anxiety grows because the Sigma remains unreadable. Some start adjusting their tone around him, laughing louder, standing straighter, or offering excessive details about irrelevant things, all subtle bids for approval. They search his face for micro-reactions, trying to decode his thoughts the way people decode cryptic messages. But the Sigma's emotional stillness reveals nothing, giving them no foothold to cling to. Instead of creating connection, their attempts at reading him only highlight their insecurity. They begin to question themselves. Did I say something wrong? Does he think I'm foolish? Why didn't he react? The Sigma hasn't judged them, but their fear of judgment makes them unravel anyway. As the monitoring intensifies, so does their emotional dependence. They begin performing rather than interacting, hoping one expression from him will validate who they're trying to be. But the Sigma male's presence rejects that dynamic entirely. His lack of response is not rejection, it's simply autonomy. And that autonomy exposes how much they rely on others to define themselves. The Sigma becomes a quiet mirror, not reflecting approval, but revealing neediness they didn't realize they carried. In the end, the validation they chase never comes, not because he denies it, but because he never participated in the game to begin with. When you strip away the noise, the reactions, and the insecurities people project onto him, a Sigma male's presence leaves one message behind. The real power isn't in being understood, it's in understanding yourself. If his silence exposed something in others, it was never about him. It was always about what they feared confronting. And if you're here, still listening, still learning, then you're already operating on a different wavelength, one that thrives on self-awareness, not validation. If this breakdown shifted your perspective, subscribe to Silent Wise and join the community that studies the psychology most people overlook. Before you scroll, ask yourself one question. What part of you reacts when faced with someone you can't read?